Hi students, welcome to HSC Earth and Environmental Science and Module 6 on hazards. This is video number 16. We're going to look at human activity and bushfires. Just before we get into this, I should also point out for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that may be watching this particular video that there are some images in this PowerPoint and therefore in the video that's created from it that contain images of people who may have passed away. So what we're going to be doing is looking at how human activities can contribute to the frequency and magnitude of some natural disasters, this one focusing on bushfires. So remember, the two key phrases that we're looking at here are frequency and magnitude. And so we're going to see what sort of human activities could have contributed to that. In terms of success criteria, we want you to be able to at least identify some human activities that can be linked to natural disasters and explain how they might be linked, especially in the context of bushfires, and then the next level from that is to be able to assess the impact. And again, those key terms of frequency and magnitude. So what is it about our First Nations people? What is it about the Indigenous people of Australia that contributed to some fire management, or at least to an increased prevalence of bushfires in Australia? And how has the native flora and fauna adapted to that increase in fire regimes? Well, one thing we do know is that there was a very large practice of regular burning in the undergrowth. In fact, this is such an important issue that there were a lot of investigations from the recent really bad bushfires, particularly dating back to about 2020, and some contributions that had been made as a result of the lack of preparation in terms of the undergrowth, and that ending of a lot of the practices of regular burning that were happening under Aboriginal management. The one thing that we do see is a mosaic. So the practice of regular burning, and one of the things that we'll look at in particular is fire stick farming. That was one of the practices that occurred, was to create a mosaic. And what that means basically is that there was a large number of areas that were in various different stages of recovery from what were much smaller fires, much smaller, much well contained. The people understood the land, they lived in harmony with the land, and were trying to make sure that they maximised the use of what the land was able to provide. But they did that in a way that sustained the management. And we see some very interesting adaptations of Australian native plants in particular to this regular fire season. One of the problems, of course, though, is once Europeans kind of took over the management of a lot of the land, and they didn't have the same understanding, or they didn't bring an understanding, or the understanding that they brought with them wasn't one that was necessarily compatible with the land that they were now occupying. And as a result of that, we saw particularly things like the lack of regular burning, the lack of back burning, created increases in the fuel loads, particularly in the understory. And the result of that was that fires, when they did come through these areas, were much hotter and much more difficult to control. And the consequence of those was that the damage that was done to the native vegetation in particular, and also to a lot of the animals that were unable to get out of the way, was quite significantly devastating to those different communities, those different ecosystems. And unfortunately, when we talk about human activity on fires, we also need to talk about arson. Arson is the deliberate setting of fires, and sometimes these fires that are set by humans are deliberate, and sometimes they're unintentional, but the consequences can be identical in either case. Open fires that are left unattended, maybe from campsites, or even cigarettes that are discarded, flicked out the window, for example, can and have led to an increased frequency of bushfires over the last 100 years in particular. So we have seen human activity specifically increasing the frequency of fires. Now, the problem too is that we've got an increase in the frequency, but we've also seen from the previous slide too that we can have an increase in magnitude. And so both of these two things working together creates this change this shift in the potential for hazards, and particularly the potential for hazards to turn disastrous. A lot of the devastation that was caused in the 2020 fires kind of got a little bit lost under the COVID blanket that we all found ourselves under through 2020 and 2021. And that was particularly disappointing, I guess, in a sense, for communities that had already lost so much through those fires, and then to have then had to go through lockdowns and things like that too were just incredibly difficult circumstances. You can get a lot of information about the national parks and the effect of fire in those different national parks. Sometimes you can see the effects of fire simply by driving around. One of the national parks that has been particularly heavily hit with fires is Lane Cove in northern Sydney. So what we want you to do is to have a little bit of a look at fire stick farming and try and delve a little bit deeper into the Indigenous Australian use of fire as a management tool, and also how this practice of human intervention and adaptations that were being favoured by the Australian bush, particularly by a lot of the plants that were natives, had kind of worked together as a mutualism in terms of the way that the development occurred as a result of each of these. It's really good if you can look for structures, particularly in eucalypts, like lignotubers. Tubers, think tubers. When we think tubers, we think potatoes. So these are under the ground. So you find lignotubers right at the base of plants, where you see little sprigs, little shoots coming up from the base of a trunk, and the trunk could be quite badly burnt, could be black, and yet you see these little growths coming up. And the other ones that are quite common as well are new growth coming from epicormic buds. And epicormic buds are also ones that can be found on blackened tree trunks. And you see these buds that are underneath the bark basically, and they push out these new little shoots. So sometimes you can kind of see these black trunks with little shoots of green all over the sides of them. And this is showing you how our native vegetation can recover after fire. Fire was a central pillar of the First Nations land management practices for thousands of years, and this is one of the reasons why we do find this relationship between the native plants in particular. I mean, think about Banksias and how they release their seed pods as a result of the melting of the resin, and the change that occurs after fire goes through those sorts of areas. In his book, The Biggest Estate on Earth, Bill Gammage described the Australian environment as a complex, interconnected system spreading across the continent, creating a single estate, albeit with many managers. And this is one of the things that we find when we look at the distribution of Aboriginal people around the country, different people in different places using strategies to manage the land efficiently and sustainably, and doing that in a lot of different ways where there was some crossover between each of these different groups that we see. So we're going to have a look at that in a little bit more detail in class. Thanks for watching.